lecture 24C, the third lecture about Argentina in the series The ABCs of Communism, and this is going to be in the 2015 edition of the book, The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2015. Now, when we had stopped at the point where the Erosion government of Argentina had refused to join the UK-French blockade of the Soviet Union. And this was more than just a refusal to join it. The Erosion government was so agitated by this attempt to stop their trade with Russia that they actually sent 5 million gold-backed pesos to the Bolshevik government instead of joining the cordon sanitaire against the Bolsheviks that the British and French had put into effect. This is the year of the 1922, as you recall, the year of the Rapallo Pact, where Lenin's diplomats made a de facto alliance with Germany against Britain and France and broke the anti-Bolshevik bloc. It was the first break in the anti-Bolshevik bloc. It would take longer to replace it. I don't want to go back over all of that. But at any rate, you can see that Argentina, not for left-wing reasons, because they'd already been slaughtering workers that were on strikes they didn't approve of inside Argentina, but they were angry because they did not want to stop trading with the Soviet Union. So they made their anger very clear. Well, during the 1920s, the anarchist movement was fueled in Argentina by the arrival of more of these emigres and deportees from Europe, especially from Italy, and then later from Spain. But it was in Italy where the first big wave of these workers came across. Mussolini invented this fascist concept of corporatism, is what he called it in English, and the idea was that society should be run by the wealthiest families, and there would be a place for workers within it in a fascist union. And so this was the system that these workers were fleeing. And when they got to Argentina, they came with the ideas they had, which were either Marxist or anarchist. But this was filling the country up with a wave of people that were essential, but on the other hand, they were also implicitly revolutionary. So in 1921, Argentina saw its own fascist counter-revolutionary movement started, called the Republican League, Liga Republicana. And any rate, it continued. It went through several organizational phases we don't need to worry about here, but it was outright modeled on Mussolini's black shirt movement in Italy. The Argentine right found its major influence in the 19th century Spanish writer Marcelino Menendez y Pelayo and in the French royalist Charles Maurras. Also in 1922, the poet Leopoldo Lugones, who had turned towards fascism and who made a famous speech in Lima, Peru, known as the Time of the Sword, in the presence of the war minister there and the future dictator Agustin P. Justo, which called for a military coup and the establishment of a military dictatorship. In 1928, however, Erosion was re-elected as president, and he began more of his reforms to increase workers' rights within that very limited framework that he was willing to accept. And that was enough, however, to intensify conservative opposition to him. And that grew even stronger after Argentina was devastated by the beginning of the Great Depression in the fall of 1929 after the Wall Street crash. So, within a year, on September 6, 1930, the Army did what it had been wanting to do, and that was staged a military coup led by a pro-fascist general named Jose Felix Uriburu, who overthrew Erosion's government and began a period in Argentina's history known as the infamous Decade. Exports of frozen beef, especially to Great Britain, provided much needed foreign currency, but trade nevertheless fell off sharply in the Great Depression. In 1929, Argentina was, however, wealthy by world standards, and that prosperity had ended in 1929 with the worldwide Great Depression. The 1930 military coup, supported by the Argentine Patriotic League, which was what the fascists now called themselves, forced Hipólito Yrigoyen from power and replaced him, as I've said, with José Félix Uriburu. Support for the coup was bolstered by the sagging Argentine economy, as well as a string of bomb attacks and shootings involving radical anarchists, which alienated moderate elements of Argentine society and angered the conservative right, which had long been agitating for decisive action by the military forces. The military coup initiated a period which was, as we've said, called the infamous decade, characterized by constant electoral fraud, persecution against everybody else, and pervasive government corruption. All of this within the milieu of the global depression. During his brief tenure as president, Uriburu cracked down heavily on anarchists and other far-left groups, resulting in 2,000 illegal executions of members of anarchist and communist groups, the sort of thing that's been going on recently in Mexico. The most famous and perhaps most symbolic of anarchism's decay in Argentina at the time was the execution of Severino di Giovanni, who was captured in late January 31 and executed on the 1st of February of that year. After becoming president in the 1930 coup, Uriburu attempted to create a constitutional reform that would include Mussolini-style corporatism in the Argentine constitution. This move toward fascism was, however, viewed negatively by conservative backers of the coup, and they turned their support to the more moderate conservative general Agustin P. Justo, who won the presidency in a 1932 election. Justo began a policy of what was then called liberal economic theory, today the neoliberal economic theory, that benefited only the nation's upper classes. The Argentine variety permitted corruption at the expense of national growth. One of the most infamous decisions of Justo's government was the creation of the Roca-Runciman Treaty between Argentina and the United Kingdom. This liberal theory treaty benefited British big banks, big capitalist importers, and the rich beef producers of Argentina at the expense of common consumers. Political confrontation between right-wing fascists and leftist radicals went on in the streets throughout the decade of the 1930s. Reactionary militarists controlled the government. Roberto Ortiz was elected president in 1937, took office the next year. Due to his fragile health, he was succeeded by his vice president, Ramon Castillo, who took power in 1940. He formally assumed leadership in 1942. Now we come to the beginning of the Peron era. The civilian government appeared to be close to joining the Allies, but many army officers and naval officers of the Argentine armed forces, as well as the ordinary Argentine citizens, objected to this joining the Allies due to fear of the spread of communism in their own country. There was a wide support to stay neutral in the conflict, as during World War I, and the government was weakest because of its poor labor rights. Now, this set the stage for the June 4th, 1943 United Officers Group military coup. That was a secret alliance between military leaders led by Generals Ramirez, Rawson, and Farrell. Farrell's protege was Colonel Juan Peron. And on that day, June 4th, 43, Peron and the army marched to Casa Rosada and demanded the resignation of President Castillo, and they got it. In the movie Evita, starring Madonna, probably the best thing she ever did on film, but an extraordinarily accurate recreation of the stage play and of the reality upon which these artistic interpretations dwell, shows these coups in their first phase, how Farrell took over, and eventually it comes to Peron. Now, not the least of which is the constant, well, when you see the movie or stage play Evita, you'll notice that the narration is being given by an actor who plays Che Guevara. because Guevara was growing up, going to high school and college during these periods of time, in medical school, and so he was directly influenced by the Peronistas, who talked a revolutionary talk as far as workers were concerned, but in practice, what Peron really wanted was a more Argentinian form of democratic Mussolini fascism. Not the least of, well, after the coup, Ramirez took power, and although he did not declare war, he broke relations with the Axis powers. Argentina's largest neighbor, Brazil, had already entered the war on the Allied side in 1942. In 1944, Farrell, an army officer of Irish-Argentine origin, spent 2 years attached to Mussolini's army in the 1920s, and via another coup, he now replaced Ramirez. Initially, his government continued to maintain a neutral policy. Toward the end of the war, Farrell decided it was in the interests of Argentina to be attached to the winning side, and so Argentina made a late declaration of war against Germany without ever actually getting involved. Juan Peron managed the relations for the junta, and especially for Farrell, between the laborers and their unions, and became highly popular because Peron would always take the union side in every kind of problem which came up. And, as I've mentioned before, his Evita Peron, who at that time was named Eva or Evita Duarte. The ITA on the end of anything just means little, so her name was Eva Duarte. Evita means little Eva. Evita organized a massive demonstration on October 17, 1945, using the popularity of her weekly radio show to force the government to free Peron, who they had just arrested, and restore him to office. Why did they arrest him? Well, there were a lot of reasons within the junta for the different generals to dislike each other. But in this particular case, they felt that Peron had gone way too far in granting everything that the meatpackers union wanted in a strike action, and so they decided to replace him. And they did. They threw him in prison. In the same way the U.S. managed the coup against Chavez and had him thrown in prison. Both of those things were reversed. I remember at the time some commentators saying, well, nothing like this, what was happening to Chavez, ever happened in Latin America before. And I said, well, what kind of scholarly background do you have? This is exactly what happened to Juan Peron. And he was freed in exactly the same way. Mass demonstrations go to the Capitol, and the people are saying, either free Juan Peron or we're going to overthrow you. And the same thing happened with Chavez and his U.S. backers. The masses of Caracas went to the Capitol and building and are saying to the generals, free Chavez or we're going to get rid of you. Now, Juan Peron, at any rate, now has a new enemy. And that is the U.S. Ambassador Sproul Braden. Now, as soon as this, you'll notice that this mass demonstration occurs on October 17th, 1945. And the red flag has been raised over the bombed-out Reichstag building since May 1st, 1945. Already by this time, the Truman Gang has gotten on the embassies of the U.S. embassies around the world to move against every progressive force in whatever country they're in. In Argentina, of course, the number one progressive was Juan Peron and his wife Eva. So they, because he married her, as soon as he got out of prison, he married her, which was a smart move. And one of the things he agreed to get out of prison was he would resign his position in the army. So now, when he came out, he was wearing a civilian coat. In the movie, they show he did exactly what he did. He would take his coat off and sometimes roll up his sleeves to show that he was one of the shirtless ones, the descamisados, the massive white Argentine workers in the meat factories. At any rate, now he's a civilian, but he's a civilian with an overwhelming support of the masses of people in Argentina. So he became president, and now in the period between 1943 and 1946, Peron shut down 110 publications. Well, these were all people that were anti-Peronista, anti-junta, for one reason or another, but part of Peron's philosophy was we only need a Peronista press. We don't need all the rest of this crap. And so he was shutting them down right and left. In the movie you'll see that as he's driving down the street with his wife, they're seeing that there are graffiti painted on the walls, death to Peron, this sort of thing. This is from all of these people who have had their newspapers and magazines shut down. At any rate, his wife began to play an even more important role in the government than any woman had ever played in Argentina. They do a good job in the movie and the stage play of showing just all the different social programs she put into effect. She created a political party, the Peronista Feminist Party, and at any rate, she was going to become his successor, at least in her mind. In 1946, Peron was elected president by an overwhelming majority, and that put the Communist Party in a tricky position because Peron was doing many of the things that they were calling upon that should be done, and therefore had really cut into the membership they normally would have had among meatpackers, for example, who were now joining in a Peronista union and giving up their membership in the UGT, or in the communist part of it at any rate. The Peron government followed an isolationist foreign policy as far as the USA and UK were concerned. Peron expanded government spending. The Truman Gang sabotage of the Argentine peso made it lose 70% of its value from early 48 to early 1950, and Evita's sudden death by an out-of-nowhere cancer made the situation intolerable as inflation reached 50% in 1951. She died in 1952, and at that point, the critical plank was withdrawn from Peron because she was the one that kept the masses of white workers in Argentina satisfied with the Peron regime. There was a military coup in 1955 that deposed Peron, and for the next 18 years he would be in exile in Franco Spain. Under Peron, the number of unionized workers had expanded to be helpful and helped build a powerful general confederation of labor. Now this was the Peronista Union. Peron turned Argentina into a corporatist country of the Mussolini fascist type, in that powerful organized interest groups negotiated for positions and resources. During these years, Argentina developed the largest middle class on the South American continent. Using the term middle class to mean middle income, as well as petty bourgeois elements. In other words, workers in the UGT, people in the meatpackers plants, were making as much money as they had ever made before or since. And that's why the Peronista Party is still important in Argentina today, in the Peronista movement. Early Peronism was a period of macroeconomic shocks, intensifying import substitution, industrialization. Multiple exchange rates favoring each individual industry and trading partner went into effect. There was a concomitant increase in state-owned property, rent and price controls, combined with high levels of public spending. Wealth was redistributed in this way, so that to this day the Argentine people remember these Peron years as the best years ever for them. Argentina had accumulated great wealth as a treasury because of the World War and the demand for beef. Consequently, Peron was able to pay off his entire foreign debt and simultaneously to nationalize foreign-owned enterprises. The IAPI extended its control to the foreign trade in all export commodities. Peron erected a system of almost complete protection against imports, largely cutting off Argentina from the international market, and naturally this infuriated US and UK capitalists who had intended to reap the profits of their World War II victory. In 1947, he announced his first 5-year plan based on growth of nationalized industry. This was also a year of peak prosperity for Argentina. Protectionism also created a domestically oriented industry with high production costs, so that it was not dependent upon the law of value in the international capitalist marketplace. So they could afford to pay workers as much as they wanted to. At the same time, output of beef and grain, the country's main export goods, found its peak production. The IAPI began shortchanging growers. When world grain prices dropped in '49, agricultural production had reached zenith. During this period, Argentina's economy continued to grow more slowly than Brazil and Chile. The combination of industrial protectionism, redistribution of income from the agrarian to the industrial sector, and growing state intervention in the economy meant consumers had more money on hand than ever before. And in this case, this was enough to drive the inflationary process. By 1950, Argentina's GDP per capita was at least half that of the USA. Peron's second five-year plan in '52 favored increased agricultural output over industrialization because industrial growth and high wages in previous years had expanded the domestic demand for agrarian goods. During the 1950s, output of beef and grain fell and the economy suffered, and the policy shift toward agricultural production created a gap in income distribution, as the majority of those who worked in agriculture labored on tiny plots, while the majority of the land was in large estates. Argentina signed trade agreements with Britain, the Soviet Union, and Chile, slightly opening the market to international trade, as Peron's second economic plan sought to capitalize on the country's comparative advantage in agriculture. Now, going back to the 1947-48 period, I believe it was 48 when Evita made her famous rainbow tour of Europe, which they show in the movie pretty nicely. And I'm just going to take a second to digress about what she was up to. One of the reasons, of course, was to promote Argentina's beef in those areas where it could. And one of the countries they wanted to promote trade with was Spain. So she went to Spain, and there she was given a wonderful reception by Franco, who, of course, was the fascist dictator of Spain. And this alienated any left support she might have had in other parts of the continent, or England for that matter. Then she went to Switzerland and eventually to Italy, where people threw eggs at her car and so on. You'll see all this in the movie, but what I'm going to point out here is something that I think is worth attention. She went to Switzerland. Now, I met a man when I was in Lurigancho, it was 1978, a German Nazi, ex-Nazi, I guess you would call him, who had emigrated to Chile and Argentina, and who had been thrown in prison in Lurigancho Center for Social Readaptation there in Lima. The only foreigner I ever met who wasn't there on a drug case. Now, I don't remember what the case was, but whatever it was cleared up within a couple weeks, and he walked out of there. But at one point while he was there, I'd been asked to go see him, or he'd asked to see me, and I normally would never have gone to talk to a former German Nazi for any reason, but under these circumstances I decided to make an exception because we were all after all, prisoners in the same place with a, at least temporarily, common enemy. And I don't even recall what it was I did for him, but at any rate, he was grateful for that. And I didn't know him very well, but he told me that the real reason that Eva Peron had gone to Switzerland was to get Bormann's money. If I would have to go back to my own book, High Finance South American Style, to go into more details of that, which I haven't done prior to this lecture, but as I recall, Bormann in his mind had not died in Germany, but had made it to Argentina. Or at least that was the conclusion I drew from what he had to say. And of course we knew that many of his friends in Chile and Argentina and Brazil, Nazi friends, had made it there. So what he told me was that the real reason she went there was because she wanted, in order to give these Nazis the protection that they wanted in Argentina from anybody that was looking for them, Peron had offered it to them, but they had to pay for it, and she had to go get the money herself because they had stashed it in Swiss banks. And he told me, well, that's, in my opinion, is the real reason she had her rainbow tour. Well, it probably wasn't the only reason, but it probably was a major reason, because she did go to Switzerland. And she had apparently an affair there with Prince Rainier, or the king, whoever it was, of Monaco at the same time. And I suspect there's more of a backstory to this than is widely known. Or maybe it is widely known to scholars that deal with that period. Maybe the Wiesenthal Center might have a better idea of what she was doing in this regard than I do. I'll pass it along to you for what it's worth. At any rate, she made this famous tour. And apparently, during the time she was there, she started to get sick. And this is where this out-of-nowhere cancer comes from that finally killed her in 1952. I'm always suspicious of these out-of-nowhere cancer cases, and I have been ever since Jack Ruby got the world's worst case. Well, he was in jail in Dallas, and you know, we've seen a lot of those ever since, and I think they always tend. I don't know how easy it is to give somebody cancer, but at any rate, it's probably worth taking a look at whenever you see that somebody's come up with some disease like that out of nowhere, and it's going to be fatal in a short period of time. And anyhow, Peron's second five-year plan envisioned all kinds of things, but the biggest problem for him was not only did it envision opening up trade with the Soviet Union again, and not to mention Britain and Chile, but he was definitely on the hit list of what the Truman Gang wanted done in Latin America. And so from that point on, Sproul Braden's every waking thought, he was the U.S. ambassador to Buenos Aires, seems to be how to get rid of Peron. And that's something that you want to, in all of the books written about Peron, he always plays an important part in the last years. At any rate, in 1955, Peron was overthrown in a military coup. He didn't have his wife to save him anymore. In that same period of time, 1957, the Communist Party of Argentina won its first 3 seats in the Constitutional Assembly, and its influence also grew in the trade unions. In 1959, it created a trade union center called it was established on their initiative, and the Frondizi won the elections the next year in 1958 when they decided to have elections and the military was going to step back. Frondizi announced the beginning of a new attempt at import substitution in oil production. Up until that time, Argentina was having to import its oil. This was the beginning of the U.S.-IMF attempt to seize the Argentine oil fields. Accordingly, in 1960, Argentina joined the Latin American Free Trade Association. However, the inflation rate increased faster, and soon real wages fell, and the IMF regime introduced tighter money, austerity, cut public programs, increased taxes on working people, jacking up their costs on utility prices. Same kind of IMF program they put into effect everywhere, which benefits no one but a tiny oligarchy at the expense of the mass of workers and working people. Another coup in June '66 brought Juan Carlos Onganía to power, and Onganía appointed a man named Krieger to head the economic ministry. His strategy was more of the same IMF policy, backed up by the use of the army and the secret police against workers and the social movement. There was what was called the Rosariazo in 1969. The worsening economy and the onset of the Onganía dictatorship led to a wave of protests and strikes. Krieger, as economy minister, witnessed increased concentration and centralization of capital in a few great Argentine families and their foreign bankers, and their takeover of many important sectors of the economy. The IMF offered strong support for this program, and economic growth continued. GDP expanded on an average annual rate of 5.2% between '66 and 1970, of which workers and farmers got far less than they ever had before. After 1966, the regime announced that it would begin promoting competition, efficiency among domestic companies and foreign investors. This meant in practice the anti-inflation program focused on reducing workers' wages and petty bourgeois salaries. Inflation decreased sharply to 7.6% in 1969, but real wages fell dramatically. A shift from import substitution was finally ending protectionism and opening the economy to the world market, which of course is what the IMF wanted. This new policy boosted exports of the big cap families while bankrupting small business people as their exports were priced out of the market. The regime stepped up the program when the currency underwent a 30% devaluation that further aggravated the situation. The return of Juan Peron. In May 1969, discontent with Krieger's economic policies led to riots in the cities of Corrientes, Rosario, and Córdoba. Krieger was removed, but the Onganía administration was unable to agree on an alternative economic policy. By 1970, the military dictatorship was confronted with massive strike waves and was no longer capable of maintaining wage restraints or public order. Per capita income fell, and so did the living standards. General elections were held on March 11, 1973, and the Peronista Party ran a man named Héctor Cámpora as a stand-in for Juan Perón, because he was already threatening to come back and lead another military coup. Of course, he wasn't in the army anymore. He'd been in exile for 18 years, but he was threatening to come back. Standing in the elections for him was Héctor Cámpora, because Perón was banned by the military from running for president. And that put an end to his 18-year exile. An Alitalia plane was provided to Perón, and he left Spain and came back to Buenos Aires. This was a tremendous reception. Now this time he came back with a second wife. This was a woman he had met as a cabaret dancer in Panama, and but as it would turn out, it was only in her mind that she was ever an equal to Evita. So she wasn't really that much help to him. But she did come back, and she was on the plane with him when he got off, as was Héctor Cámpora, who had gone there with to get him. So on June 20th, 1973, Perón returned from Spain and ended his 18-year exile. This reception at the airport featured 3.5 million people waiting to greet Perón. So there was no question about who was going to take over the Argentinian government. And I don't think there was ever a time there were that many people before in a mass demonstration in Buenos Aires for any reason. So it was clear that the Argentine people wanted Perón back, and they wanted an end to the crap that they'd been going through since his overthrow in 1955. Well, 1974, the U.S. moves to establish fascism in its own image in Argentina and all of South America. We've already discussed what the Truman Gang did. They set the pattern for extreme reactionary policies in all the U.S. embassies, emanating from all the U.S. embassies in Latin America. And by 1974, they were on the march again. Not under Truman, of course, anymore, but they were on the march again, and they were overthrowing, in 1974, they would overthrow the government in Chile, put in the Pinochet dictatorship. Now they are going to overthrow the government in Argentina. And, of course, they were overthrowing governments in other places, which we have already reviewed as we've gone through these lectures. So 1974 was a key year. It was a year they put Pinochet in power in Chile, and we're going to talk about that more in the next series of lectures. In 1974, they were at the airport too. They had a bunch of riflemen positioned. When I say they, I'm talking about the U.S. CIA. They shot and killed 13 people at the airport, and 365 more were wounded. This became known as the Ezeiza Massacre. That's the name of the airport, the Ezeiza Airport in Buenos Aires. Perón would last as president less than 1 year, from October 12, 73 to July 4th, 74. The Gringo regime had been forced to take him as an interim leader, and they used their own gunmen for the Iciza massacre, as they would later do in Kiev, as you've seen just this year, 2014. They brought their Nazi thugs out of the western part of Ukraine and overthrew the government in Kiev, and now all of that is still going on. Well, that wasn't the first one. There were many of them, and of course Chile was one, now Argentina is another. Now I mean 1974. And they imposed a reign of terror on Argentina beginning in 1974 with this coup. Peron proved incapable of seizing the initiative from the conspirators, and his Panamanian cabaret dancer wife, Maria Estela Martinez, Isabel, proved to be Eva Duarte's replacement in her mind only. 1974 is the year that the U.S. CIA IMF conspirators took down the governments of Argentina and Chile. Peru and Colombia would soon follow. These were neither spontaneous nor coincidental happenings. Of course, the ideologists of the Gringo media and academia still try to portray them as such. You now know what was really happening. This policy continues to this very day as the Wolfowitz-Kagan doctrine, and it came to dominate all thinking within the U.S. ruling trillionaire oligarchy of Rockefeller, Mellon, Morgan, DuPont, et al., and their think tanks. It will continue until the communist movement leads our allies in the final destruction of that cabal and began its rule with its seizure of Washington, and is ending now with the dissolution of the Gringo Empire worldwide. I think that's what you're looking at worldwide right now, is the dissolution of the U.S. empire. So 1974 is where we're going to cut this off, because to follow it through the period of the U.S. imposed dictatorship on up to the modern times is another story. So in the same way that we've cut off all of the South American countries after the initial seizure of power by the revolutionary forces, or after a certain equivalent date, we're going to stop here in Argentina. And in the next lecture, well, I'll continue with that in the 2015 lectures that come about with the 2016 edition of this book. But the next lecture in this series, and the last for now, is going to be on Brazil, the fight for communism in Brazil, which will be lecture number 25, and which I'm going to do next. I want to just make a couple of initial comments about that, and that is this. You may not know it, but at the moment, and I'm speaking now at I'm about halfway through November of 2014, the Brazilian government is conducting a 5-battalion military exercise, rather quietly actually, on the defense of the Amazon against a U.S. invasion. Now, I think a lot of this is due to the fact that the Snowden matter woke the Brazilians up to the fact that they are the #1 target of U.S. imperialist strategy. And the NSA has spent more time tapping Brazilian phones, and especially its leaders, than anywhere else in Latin America. What this has led the Brazilian leaders to think is that the U.S. would like to break Brazil up into several countries, and they don't know exactly how they're going to do that. But that's why this defense of the Amazon against a U.S. invasion military campaign that's going on right now, training program, exercises they call them, is being conducted. Because the last election showed us something. They showed us that the progressive forces in Brazil are undefeatable in the northeastern part of the country. But the southeast, where they're having a water shortage problem, and so on, in Sao Paulo, which is an industrial center that should have gone more heavily for the Lula party than it did, the Workers' Party, is being heavily subverted by U.S. CIA and NSA agents who are hoping to exploit the problems down there and start an independence movement of some kind that will break Sao Paulo away from the rest of the country. That is the Sao Paulo region of Brazil, not just the city, but that whole southeastern part of the country. Then you have the far western part of the country, which all the way from Leticia, Colombia, Tabatinga, Brazil, which is the bordering town, across the base of the Andes Mountains to the Rondônia part of Brazil. And Rondônia used to be a separate country. So these are areas that could be split up also. And apparently U.S. imperialism's strategy for Brazil long term is to break it up into several other countries. So with those comments in mind, I'm going to stop now, and we will now get to the next lecture. We'll talk about Brazil, which also has the most extensive primitive communist archaeological evidence in Argentina, in all of South America, and we'll begin with our discussion of that.